They have every right to do so, and the tax cap has absolutely no meaning to what the voters choose to do with the budget. So there's where the restriction applies. They can't present us a budget more than a 2.5% increase. But if we want to do more, we certainly can. And if we want to do less, we can. And if we want to agree with them, we can. Now, sometimes that's painful, I understand. But, all right, thank you.
Mr. Leato.
Lou Leato from Groton. The statement was made by one of the previous speakers that we've had one opportunity to test the mettle of this measure, and it worked just fine. Thank you very much. I submit, had it worked just fine, that is, if all of its intended consequences were the only thing that we would have gotten, we wouldn't have required a special act of the legislature to rescue us. Having said that, I'm not demeaning it, I'm just simply pointing out that there are yet to be discovered unintended consequences of things that we do. Now, the second point that was made by one of the previous speakers was that we can change whatever the Budget Committee recommends to us in this session. That's certainly true. There are two flaws with that I see. One is the Budget Committee and its deliberations, and along with the with the school board's input, is an informed group of people that are informed to a much higher degree about the nitty-gritty of issues, budgetary issues, academic issues, etc., than the average person in the district. We elect them and rely on them to do due diligence, and they do very good due diligence, regardless of whether or not I agree with them. They work hard and are well informed in the issue. So I would expect them to come forth with their best understanding of the best budget. And if they are restricted in doing that because of the consequences of this article that we're living under, that's not in our best interests. Furthermore, as in a year not too long ago, when a significant change to the budget was made from the floor, one of the consequences of that was significant discord, significant discontent and anger within the community. I don't perceive that this forum should be the regular way we alter budgets. I believe maybe a little tweak here or an adjustment there perhaps, but the informed budget that comes to us ought to be unconstrained by external issues and mostly constrained by your assessment of the financial capabilities of the district and your assessment of the academic needs of the district. And I encourage you to rescind this amendment.
Thank you. Ms. Gordon?
Hi, Dorcas Gordon, Bristol. I'm in favor of this article and the rescission of the tax cap. I was so, frankly, disappointed last year when our community voted this in. It almost makes me upset. I just think of us as a community that's so much more thoughtful and progressive than this article would suggest. I don't necessarily think that spending more money is the answer to better schools, but in a given year where an increase of over 2% is warranted, I want our district and our budget committee, who we've elected and we entrust, as we've talked about today, to have the ability to do this to meet the legitimate educational needs of our community.
Okay. Anybody else want to speak? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Just to reiterate, neither the school board nor the budget committee has taken a position on this article. I believe we both would like to allow the voters to decide. With that said, I have asked Dan Rossner, our business administrator, to present some educational slides to elaborate further on what this means so that you can have that data before you make your choice.
Ms. Johnson, would you mind turning that projector back on? Thank you. I've been asked to I've been asked to just provide some basic slides to show the mechanics of how the tax cap works so that you can make a decision, a better informed decision about whether you want to move forward with tax cap or in the direction of this article. There's not meant to be any bias or opinion conveyed here. So, that being said, we're going to use some numbers that are pretty close to the district's numbers, but they're rounded for simplicity. Here's the budget committee charge and mandate with a tax cap in place. If the previous year's budget, $20 million, about $8 million from the state, and the net local raised is $12 million. So with the tax cap in place as we have it this year, with a 2% tax cap, that affects the net amount raised locally, that $12 million. Gives you a limit on the increase of $240,000. Assuming the state aid remains constant, the total that the school budget committee can recommend would be the $20,240,000. And just there's the demonstration of how it works. The footnote to that is that this includes additional articles on the warrant for new money. So, for example, because the budget committee recommended approval of the new teachers agreement, the $56,000 that warrant article costs is included in that $240,000 number. This is intended to be a demonstration of what the power of the legislative body at this first deliberative session is. Using the same numbers, there's a 10% limit. So the budget committee has the 2%, the local legislative body has 10%. And this is using the same demonstration with 10%. It gives you, and it's an up or down number. Means the maximum raised locally could be anywhere between 10.8 million and 13.2. Give for a total total range, if you will, of 18.8 to 21.2, assuming the state aid remains the same. That's really just meant to be the mechanics of it. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Just go the microphone so we can get you on the record.
Dan, are you familiar with the RSA that allows the school district or a town meeting to go above and beyond the 10%?
No, I'm not.
Well, there certainly is one. Okay? And the second question I would have is, you have indicated on the slide on the right-hand side talking about the 10% that you can only reduce it 10%, and I don't believe that's accurate either. The legislative body can reduce it to 0 if they choose to do that.
I would disagree with that statement because we have legal responsibilities that must be met. And if you had a budget of 0, I would bring counsel forward if he could have an opinion on that. He agrees with me. You couldn't bring it to 0 because you have legal responsibilities.
But it could be lower, is what I'm saying, greater than 10%. I'm not saying 0.
Mr. Westfall.
Todd Westfall, Alexandria. I didn't support this warrant article last year for the tax cap. I thought it was pretty restrictive. I understand where it comes from. For years I've been attending these meetings, and every year there's a proposed increase by a certain group in the community. And I think that this warrant article came about because people were concerned over that. They wanted to exercise some sort of control. It was overwhelmingly voted in. I think it's going to be hard to get out. Again, it is restrictive. I think, as Mr. Lieto had said, we should be able to trust our elected officials, and this group that we have here has done an outstanding job at representing everyone in the district, I think, both the budget committee and the school board. They've done a great job in trimming the budget. Dan Rosner has done that, through the years. The budget is really under control at this point. They have been handcuffed. They've had to come forward with lower budgets. Overall, it has been a net gain for the district, but I think that it's going to be more difficult as we move forward. And we're going to have to rely on amendments or articles going into adding on to the budgets. I think 2% is in future years is going to be very restrictive to the district.
Thank you. Ms. Cody?
Janet Cody, Bristol. I'm directing this, I think, to Budget Committee. Last year, you came to us saying with our comparison to other districts that we should be an $18 million district, and we got approved for $20 million. You were able to cut things down to $20 million, and we went along with that. And this 2% cap was trying to go along with what you were saying for those districts, as I recall some of the discussion from last year. My concern is if we saved $500,000 in this last year's budget, that was the $20 million budget, and we're going ahead and adding 2% to that, and we have padded the budget for the contingencies, that we're still on the basis of not necessarily being in comparison to other districts, with those comparison numbers being the quality of education improving for the money that we're spending. So my concern is for the cap to stay in place until such time as we really have a handle on those comparisons as well as what we're spending for our education dollar. And that's all I have to say.
If you just want to make that one.
I'd just like to make one clarification to your statement, Ms. Cody, and that's that last year's budget was a little over $24 million. The year we're in now is the first year with the substantial reduction.
Mr. Wheeler first.
Bruce Wheeler again from Bristol. I'm a little concerned with this cap. We're in a building that I believe is 23 years old. And to the best of my knowledge, the roof has been repaired. I think the facilities manager has done an excellent job in making sure that it stays dry inside, but someday that's going to need to be replaced. That's the nature of life. I can't imagine tying the budget committee's hands to the point where we say you can't recommend a roof replacement when you honestly think it's needed, unless we can take all that money out of other educational expenses that particular year. So they're left in a position of not recommending the budget that they may honestly feel is needed because it would raise it more than the 2%, and that just is intolerable. I've got a lot of respect for the opinion that they provide us when they study the budget as carefully as they do. I don't always agree with them, but I do know that they look at it very carefully, and if they say we need more money, I think I'm likely to believe them. And having a tax cap stand in the way so that they can't say that to us just doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Sir?
Mike Gelderman from Bristol. I have a question and a comment. Question, is there any inflation tie into this? There's no allowance for inflation? No. Okay, one thing right there, average inflation is 4% over the last, historically last 50 years. The last few years, because we've been in a recession, we've seen a lot less inflation. We've also seen not much gain in the average person's wages and things like that. All it would take for this recession to end to really destroy our schools on this, just if we had normal inflation. Any growth in the town, we would not be allowed to tax, say, new residents levy the same taxes. We'd have to lower overall tax rates, which would be a good thing, but we couldn't actually raise extra revenue. Say if we had some positive development, more children in town, maybe we'd have to pay for maybe some more roads to maintain. That would actually limit this, the budget of the school going up, even if more revenue would be coming to the town, more net revenue would be coming to the town. So I could think about 5 more unintended consequences right away of this thing, where this law, which sounds great, there's not enough, it's just, I guess, too black and white in a world that really isn't that black and white. There's so many things that could happen. Any business would go out of business if they levied this into their own budgets in a very short order. So I'm just thinking, it sounds like a great idea, but inflation alone will basically take down the schools on this. If we have any prosperity, which is starting to kick in, happens as we like it to, we're assuming that all people will continue to, all of us will accept wages of less than 2% increase per year indefinitely, that oil, gas, cost of living is going to stay below 2% per year annually. So as long as this thing's in effect, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences that we can't necessarily legislate out. We'll be going to legislature every other year here to try and fix some other loophole in this. So just want to make those comments.
Thank you. Slim?
Steve Spafford, Groton. I know that the school board has done a great job over the years of projecting, and I know Vinnie there wrote a letter to the one of the newspapers I read, saying how and the reason the budget has to go down is because we don't have the participation in the schools, the attendance anymore. And over the years, I know you people have projected how many kids are expected years down the road. And I just think that until such time happens, it's not going to happen that fast, that we can't go and just say, oh, all of a sudden we're going to have a big influx with inflation because of inflation of kids in schools. And also with all the hype going on about the wind towers, nobody's going to want to move into the area anyway because it's going to be ruined.
Okay. Are you about ready to...
Yeah.
Mr. Lieto, do you want to speak? We'll give you that opportunity. You'll be the last speaker. Go ahead. You'll be the last speaker.
I'm not going to make any gratuitous comments about the advantages or disadvantages of alternative energy systems. But I think it's important to note that the question of unintended consequences is really at heart. The people facing us, facing the audience here, any of you who have gone to a few of their meetings have to appreciate the extraordinary amount of time and energy they put into it. If in fact we can make that decision for them by putting such a thing as a tax cap in place, I think that they in fact can take a lot more time and stay home with their families, because it's really not being very beneficial. I don't want to.
Okay,
I move we end discussion.
Okay. Mr. Lieto's moved that we close debate. He can't really speak and make that motion, but we're going to give him that opportunity. And seconded by Ms. Cody. And we're all going to have an opportunity to vote on this on March 12th on town meeting day. All those in favor of closing discussion on Article 6, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And all those opposed say nay. We're going to move on to Article 7, which is the operating budget. Shall the Newfound Area School District raise and appropriate as an operating budget, not including appropriations by special warrant articles and other appropriations voted separately, the amount set forth on the budget posted with the warrant, or as amended by vote of the first session, for the purposes set forth therein, totaling $21,735,070. $21,735,070. Should this article be defeated, the default budget shall be $22,065,040. $22,065,040, which is the same as last year, with certain adjustments required by previous action of the Newfound Area School District or by law. Or the governing body may hold one special meeting in accordance with RSA 4013, 10, and 16 to take up the issue of a revised operating budget only. Again, this is recommended by both the Budget Committee and the School Board. And Ms. Wendelbo, are you speaking to this?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. As many of you are well aware, last year we had an overflow room. There were a number of proposals that were a part of that operating budget that a lot of people had a lot to say about. This year, this budget is recommended by both the school board and the Budget Committee. We are in agreement on this. There are no teacher reductions or staff reductions in this budget. As you heard earlier with the warrant article, there is a small increase on teacher step salaries. There is a modest increase for support staff in this budget. There are no proposals to close any schools or to move students from one school to another grade-wise. It's a well-thought-out budget. There were areas that went up, and there were other areas that were able to be adjusted to stay within that 2% tax cap. As Mr. Leo mentioned, the Budget Committee bylaw cannot bring forward a budget that's more than a 2% increase over the local taxes raised for the prior year. The school board did not have that parameter, and so the number that they came up with was within that tax cap as well. So we ask that you support this recommendation, and would be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Want to close debate? No. Any questions, comments? Mr. Spafford?
Yes, Steve Spafford Groton again. The Budget Committee did a fantastic job this year. I know only because my better half sits on it. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't pay attention as much, I guess. But I'm just saying that they did a terrific job, and I want to congratulate them on that. And the board concurred, I believe, also. I remember the budget meeting that we had, a hearing that we had also, and that at that time Dan said he was working on a way to raise it. Well, he did it, and my question is, why do we have to, whenever anybody goes into the voting booth, in the past, up until recently, in the past few years, all of a sudden, the default budget is bigger. People know me, they see me in stores, they stop. How come this happens? And I said, ask them. Why do they do that? Whoever heard of a default budget higher? I never did until it started happening in this district here a few years ago. Therefore, Mr. Moderator, I have an amendment. I'd like to amend Article 7 to read second sentence. Should the article be defeated, the default budget shall be $21,735,060.
Okay.
Submitted by me.
Well, first of all, is there a second to the motion? Huh? Well, we'll make that determination, but we'll first of all see if there's any second to the motion. Mr. Cody seconds the motion. And I guess there's a question that's been raised, a procedural question as to whether or not the default budget can be amended. And I'm going to call upon our legal counsel to offer his opinion.
The default budget is determined either by the school board or in some instances by the budget committee if it's delegated to the budget committee and cannot be amended by this meeting.
Having heard that opinion, yes, we're not going to proceed on the amendment. And are there any other discussion or comments here today? Mr. Westfall?
Todd Westfall, Alexandria. Question for legal counsel regarding the default budget. In years past, and I would assume this year as well, one of the line items that's been increased to bring the default budget up above, the last year's budget has been an estimated increase in the cost for heating oil. This is not under contract. We don't have a contract for next year's heating oil. And we have no legal obligation to heat our, buildings, round the clock or to keep the thermostat at a certain level. Obviously, there may be a, loosely interpreted legal obligation to keep our kids from freezing to death, which, obviously we don't want to do that. But I'd like to hear from legal counsel how it is legal under the current RSA, which only allows for increases based on seemingly contractual obligations, how we can add in an amount based on an estimate for the upcoming year.
So your question, as I understand it, is whether or not estimates over and above current contracted amounts can be applied to create the default budget.
I believe they have been applied and probably were applied again this year. They always have been for
But that's
heating,
your
for
que-
heating oil in particular is a good example.
And your question is whether or not that's legal.
Correct, thank you.
Would you mind addressing that? Or would somebody mind addressing that?
I'll address one portion of it, which is the heating oil, which is the same cost in the default budget as the current year. The default budget for next year is costed at $3 a gallon for heating oil, just like we're budgeted this year.
So there aren't any estimated costs that would be increased over the contracted amounts in the current budget? And the answer to that was correct? Okay.
Yeah, if I could just get a clarification from council, though, since it's been done in the past, you know, if that is legal to do under the RSA.
Well, it's not being done in this budget, as I understand it.
Well, you know, that's what we've heard, but then again, we're seeing it 300,000 higher, correct, than last year's budget. So obviously, there's some increases somewhere.
Well, would you like to ask the question?
So the question would be if we're not contractually obligated, and there is something that's been estimated to, you know, that will cost more, is
Right.
it legal to do that under the default budget?
Well, rather than do that, why don't we start with having them explain why the default budget is the amount that it is, and that you can make a determination as to whether or not they're using these estimated values. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I thought it might be helpful for me to just show everyone the methodology, how the default budget was built. So the budget for the current year, which is fiscal year 13, that was approved last year by the voters was what my file name is FY13 V3. It was the third version. So I started by taking that file, which I build the budget in Excel spreadsheet form, and then we push it into, after it's approved by the voters, we push it into our financial management system. So this is fairly clear from my perspective, and I know I work with, a little different for me because I work with the numbers every day, but I started with the file from the current year that was approved last spring. I changed, I've misspelled health there, I'm noticing. I changed the health insurance premiums to reflect the rate increases that we've been notified in advance by our health insurance underwriter. I've changed the employer's portion, the employer's contribution to the NHERS, is the New Hampshire Employee Retirement System, rates to reflect state law. I have changed energy costs, and let me exactly tell you what I've done. We've made no change. Let me just reduce this a little bit. Can everyone still see that? Okay, so specifically, we made no change to the heating oil. We've decreased electricity because of our new contract, and we've put in a small increase for diesel fuel because we do have to run the school buses, and we were under budgeted there. And I can bring up my energy cost model projections if you'd like to see them. So I understand your legality. You want to know from council if it's legal for us to change the cost of our diesel fuel, and I'll let him answer that in a minute. We've changed the out-of-district because we do have, not for projected cases, but known cases of students that need to be placed in facilities outside the district. We've removed the expenses for the life safety code improvements that were made at New Hampton as one-time expenses, which is another portion of the law governing how a default budget's created. We've reduced the bond payments per the schedule, the debt schedule, for example, where we have resignations and retirements from staff, we have, and this last item is one I would call you to make specific attention to. This is one of those items where the governing body that has the authority to build the default budget has some interpretation and some flexibility. So for example, if you have a teacher who in the current year's budget is making $50,000, you could leave that salary, even if you know they're retiring, you could leave that position salaried at $50,000 for the default budget for next year because you're not reducing the position. You could also take the more conservative approach, as I would characterize the school board's approach in how they've directed me to build the default budget with their guidance, and assume that if you have a more senior person retiring and you know they're retiring, assume that you're going to bring in, as I spoke earlier, someone with less experience, a more junior teacher, if you will, at a lower salary, and use that lower salary both in the projected and the default. And that's an example of some of the flexibility that the body that's charged with building the default has, and an example of how this school board has chosen to build their default.
So that still leaves the question as to whether or not estimating the cost of diesel fuel could be included in there?
Right, I would ask Mr. Bronson to answer that. You just dropped it on the floor, thank you.
Well, I don't know, as my opinion is that relevant. It's my understanding that these budgets are reviewed by the Department of Revenue Administration that has overall authority throughout the state to determine whether or not these default budgets are correct. And it's my understanding that everything was reviewed by DRA and found to be in compliance with the statutes and regulations. So I think the answer to your question is, would it be better if every figure were to the penny as per outstanding contracts? Yes. Is that possible? I don't think so, and I think that's why DRA shows some flexibility.
Well, I don't think that DRA does much else than rubber stamp what comes across their desk, to be honest with you, Mr. Bronstein. But, getting back to the legal issue of it, I think that, this default budget was built in a very thoughtful manner. However, when you're talking about, why is there such an increase, every year there's an increase to the default budget. A lot of people think the default budget should stay what last year's budget was. And, the fact is that there are areas that could be legally challenged. And if anyone wants to do that, I think that you've heard a very, sort of weak argument as to, why estimated values are allowed to go in there. And I've heard legal counsel in the past say that they were surprised that no one has come along and challenged it in court.
Thank you. I think there's a common sense sort of feeling about it that if you have a default budget, it should be less than what you're voting on. And I think most people understand that. That doesn't necessarily mean there isn't some legal rationale for the way it's been constructed. I think that's the way I'd put it. Mr. Anderson, I think you were waiting longer.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I had a comment to make, and I wanted to thank the Budget Committee. I know there was a lot of challenges this past year due to the reaction of the electorate and deciding on the budget and some of the cuts that were made. And I appreciate all the due diligence you put in. You probably put in extra hours, the school board as well, to kind of accommodate the electorate. But I do want to challenge you in this short-term thinking when I asked the question about defined benefit programs. I moved here in '97, and my company in '97 didn't vote or request of me. They demanded of me a 12% contribution over 3 years for my health care at a time when they were giving 2 to 4% raises. And when you factor in inflation, just a moderate inflation of 3%, it was a net negative for our family of low single digits. And so when you negotiate, and I respect collective bargaining and negotiations, I'm glad we have that ability for our teachers. When you negotiate one-year terms from a 90% contribution down to an 87% contribution, in the private sector, we sit here and we scratch our heads and wonder, do you really live in that much of a bubble? And I would encourage, if we could have a little more dialogue with the union over a longer period of time, what would make common sense. Maybe you can't make the same contribution as in the private sector for whatever reason, but I think something a little more equitable than a 3% over 1 year, and then we're going to negotiate it again the next year and then the next. It seems like what's going on in Washington with stopgap measures in terms of our financial policies, which is frankly a drain on the economy. So I'd encourage you to do that. And again, I want to leave with a positive, big thank you from all the electorate, at least for me, for working with that budget that was handed to you and really delivering on that. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thune?
John Thune, Bristol. I stand today to express some happiness and some disappointment at the same time. The disappointment is that this budget isn't lower. Quite frankly, we spend too much in the schools on things that perhaps don't need to be spent on. I've stated that on several past occasions, and I've identified some specific things that I've suggested for that. I'm happy that the budget isn't higher. And because of the strange rules that what used to be known as Pt2, RSA 40, causes us to do, we now have the opportunity to vote yes to get the smaller budget. In the past in this district, we've had to vote no to get the smaller budget. And so I really think that while the people here to be commended for getting a budget that didn't effectively go up, we need to encourage those that are staying on and the successors of those that don't stay on to work towards a much lower budget in the future. We talked last year about being an $18 million district. That's still a long ways from 21.7. And by the way, the difference between the default budget and the recommended budget here is about 1.5%. So, I'd like to encourage everybody to take and work on having, let's say, a 5% cut next year. And, well, seriously, review what's gone down and work very hard. Target where we're going. I don't know how many students there are in the district. I did a quick calculation. If there's 1,500, we're spending, I believe, about $15,000 a student. That's a lot of money. But I stand here to support what's here, and I would at the same time like to remind everybody to not beat on their town budget committees, because the tax rate is set primarily in this area by what the school board spends. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Amy Kench, Bristol.
What was the last name?
Kench.
Thank
Bristol.
you.
The sorry, I'm a little nervous.
It's okay.
But the comment that was just made that we're spending $1,500 per student, 15,000, sorry, per student. Could I just ask Dan, is that an accurate number, and does that include students across the board? Because I know one of the comments that has been made by several board and budget committee members is that the budget should be lower because the number of students is reducing. But I've also heard that we're getting more special needs students coming into the district, and each one of those students actually costs more money than a non-special needs student. So I'm just wondering, has it been calculated out, the money that we are actually spending for the non-special needs students compared to the students that do have special needs? And I understand there's all different levels of special needs, but I've heard in several meetings the comment that we did have a student who moved to the district, I think 1 or 2 years ago, that we're spending $100,000 to send out of district, which if that's a student who came in and we're spending that $100,000 to send them out of district, that's taking $100,000 less going into the schools for the non-special needs students. And also I was wondering about the tech upgrades that were supposed to take place. In last year's budget, I believe they were pushed off because of the decrease. So I was just wondering if they happen this year, because I know students are sharing computers and sharing books and not being able to take books home. And if we don't have those upgrades to our technology in the schools, our students won't be able to compete moving forward.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kent.
Is Dan going to answer? Or?
He is. Okay. Somebody's going to answer, I guess. But there were several questions, and they were specifically with regard to cost per student, special education, putting off technical upgrades. And I don't know who would like to address those.
Just by way of point of information, did we get a count on Friday for students?
I did not get a count.
Okay.
Our October 1 enrollment was 1,268.
Yeah, the current number of students that we're educating is 1,268, and it continues to decline. That is the direction that it has been going in for several years.
The budget proposal for FY14 of that's the number in front of you. I'm going to speak to Fund 10, which is the general fund. Grants and food service are really not relevant for the discussion, in my opinion. 15,000 is an accurate number. It's 15,500 to be precise, and that includes numbers that are not generally in the state number. That if you go to the state DOE website for cost per student around the state, they remove things like transportation and bond payments and some other things. So the 15,500 is accurate. As far as tech upgrades, we're in the final year of our most recent 3-year technology plan. Many of the technology upgrades that were removed from the previous year's budget have been implemented this year. We are, in terms of a student computer ratio, we have gotten to the level that was called for in the 3-year plan that was approved by both the school board and the state 3 years ago. We do not have a plan to get to a 1-to-1 ratio, so students, from my perspective, unless there's a radical change in philosophy, students will always be sharing computers in this district. You brought up textbooks as well, so I would just say one of the initiatives we're still developing that we hope to present to the board from an administrative standpoint, we hope to present to the board and the community as large in the very near future speaks to what are called e-books, or using things like iPads or Kindles or Nooks or these other devices to bring textbooks onto those devices, and you'd require more of those devices than the computers we have now, but they're also much more cost effective. But it would enable you to update your books more regularly, and it also would enable, there's a whole host of benefits to moving forward with the ebook initiative, but that proposal isn't complete yet, so we haven't been able to present it to the board and the public yet.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. You don't need to sign that.
Okay. Lauren Terrio from Bristol. I have noticed a lot of people saying thank you to the board and the budget committee, and I'd like to say thank you as well, but I would hate for the meeting to go by without saying thank you to the teachers, support staff, and administrators who are working harder, if not harder this year than before with a lower budget, and how great of a job that they're doing. I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
I have a question for Ruby Hill. Is that possible?
Well, no, you asked the question of the moderator. We'll find somebody to answer your question for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I'd like to, I'm sorry.
Well, maybe this time.
I'd like to know how the program that you were researching and that you're putting forward on K through 8 is progressing.
Is there a special program that you know about? There's a study? Would you like to address that? Yep. It's not, but I think if we can get a quick answer, I think we can close the debate and move on.
I'm just going to give a status update and say that we met, in fact, last night to tour 2 of the buildings. We have 1 meeting left to really go over data, and then after that, we will probably be making a report, and so we'll probably need another meeting after that to work on our report. But there's a lot of data on the website for you to look at. Right now there's data about test scores, about cost per student, about incidences, which is like discipline issues. And I would like to make a general comment about our budget too, if I can. and just say that with the 2% tax cap and a 10% cut in the budget last year, when we talk about unintended consequences, we don't know what some of that fallout is yet, and we're still discovering that. We had to make some staff changes after the year began, because you can't say these 20 kids are just like these 20 kids. And so somebody said black, white versus gray. This is a gray environment, and we want to make sure that as we move forward, whether we reduce the budget or increase the budget, that the primary focus is getting the kids a good education. So.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Did you have something you want to say?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. There was a question that was asked earlier that did not get answered, and it was about special education costs, and there was a number thrown out of $100,000 that it's costing the school district. That's not quite accurate, and that there is catastrophic aid where the state gives a greater reimbursement or the federal government gives a greater reimbursement for very high cost children. You might recall earlier that Mr. Rosner talked about us getting $300,000 in Medicaid reimbursement when we had only budgeted for $200,000. That's a reflection that you always have to bear in mind, that there is some other monies that come in towards that cost. So that $100,000 is not a net cost. It might be a total cost, but it's not a net cost to the district. It's usually much lower. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Cody.
Janet Cody, Bristol. Just to get a clarification on amounts, whatever, special programs, could somebody define that? Is that special needs, or is that all other programs other than regular education programs?
Could I just ask you, I'm not sure what page you're looking at. Is there a four-digit code, like 1,200 or 1,300 or 14?
I'm looking on page 2, and it would be 1,200.
1,200 is all related to special education.
It's all special
Yeah.
education. So it's clear that...
There's a small, let me correct that, there's a very small portion embedded within the 1,200 function, which is summer school. And there's two types of summer school. There's summer school for those students who are what we call identified students that require year-round services. And there's also a very small budget, it's about $25,000 to provide summer school for the non-identified students who need some catch-up time.
So special needs really contributes to half of the program costs, or just about half of the program costs for our students.
It's approximately, it's about a $5 million number in total for the total 1,200 section,
Right.
if I'm correct?
Right, was 4 million something, and
Yeah.
we're looking at 8 million for regular programs. We're looking at almost half. And basically what I want to say is I followed what's going on with the school district this year. I attended meetings and so forth, and our school board has taken into advisement and committee work on special needs, the K through 8 questions that this format had brought out last year, and warrant articles, and many, many other issues that have come before them, including dealing with negotiations for teachers, etc., looking at health commitments for the district as well. They've done a commendable job at taking on these tasks and looking at these things, and I expect that there'll be more information coming forward. The Budget Committee has done very well at looking at these numbers and dealing with the constraints of the 2% cap. I think we should applaud our volunteers that come out and do this kind of work for our students, but I also think that it is something that we all as people don't just come to one meeting and understand what goes on for this district. You need to follow it, you need to understand it, and you need to be cognizant of what it is for our children in this community, to educate them. It does cost money, but we want it to be value and a purpose in mind, so that we have good students coming out of this district and hopefully coming back to this district. So the communities have their own responsibilities there. But I want to thank them for what they've done this year and what I've observed.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Unless somebody else wants to come to the microphone, I'll take a motion to close the debate after this speaker, okay?
Hi, Amy Fairbank, Bristol. When you were talking about the numbers for 15,000 per kid, Dan, do you have the numbers that separate out for the regular ed students and the monies that are separated out for regular ed to the special ed, and then the division of that money for special ed to the regular ed kids? Because I know in past, and I know some people speak to the fact that it's 15,000 per kid, and our special ed, we do a really good job in our schools to protect and educate and prepare them the best that we can. And that is regulated by the state, that those monies be available to those kids. That's not money you can mess around with. That is allocated directly for their protection and their education. The adjustment of any monies that we would be doing would be for our regular ed students. And so if I'm not mistaken, last year, it kind of worked out, if I remember correctly from Dan's presentation, that our kids, our regular ed kids, were actually being educated more at between 10,000 and 11,000, which is on state, if you separate out the regular ed money. And so I know from my own, I have 3 kids in this district. If we have to take the budget and cut it down by some of the request of some of these people out here that aren't really understanding the money distribution for regular ed and special ed, my kid's going to be educated on a lower level because my kids don't need that money. That's regulated by the state. And that my kids are suffering for that if you keep cutting the budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ozier's made a motion to close the debate and seconded by Mr. Leado. All those in favor of closing debate on Article 7 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Thank you so much for coming out today.